this new information I have about the student needs. So that's information about learning needs, but there's also this funny term I've used in the title, student engagement. One of the definitions I like the most is this one from the Educational Glossary. In education, student engagement refers to the degree of attention, curiosity, interest, optimism and passion that students show when they're learning or being taught, which extends to the level of motivation they have to learn and progress in their education. Generally speaking, the concept of student engagement is predicated on the belief that learning improves when students are inquisitive, interested or inspired, and that learning tends to suffer when students are bored, dispassionate, disaffected or otherwise disengaged. So far so obvious. But student engagement as a phrase could have two possible meanings. One, it could be that we are engaging the students, engagement of students, or it could mean that students are engaging themselves, engagement by students. And I'd like to offer a midpoint between these two. So students ultimately responsible for engaging themselves. I can't make a student engage if they don't want to. But we as teachers can encourage and help them. And in fact, you might argue that we have a responsibility to help them engage as much as we can. There are 3 dimensions of engagement that have been identified by Vicky Trowler in a literature review from 2010, which is also on QM+. And actually that review is really useful because it has a lot of literature around student engagement and the different ways that it's been used in educational research. But the first of the 3 dimensions is behavioural engagement. So this is where students comply with ground rules and behavioural norms and don't behave disruptively. So this isn't just being obedient, this is students being in the class and wanting to learn and knowing that in order to get the best out of the class that they can, they need to sit down, they need to stop talking when you're talking, they need to do what you tell them to, they need to prepare for the lesson, simple things like that. And often this is seen as an issue of discipline. But when students are disengaged, it's important to ask, well, why are they disengaged? Why are they more interested in talking to their friends on Facebook than they are in listening to my lecture? So behavioural engagement, when students aren't talking to their friends on Facebook, they are listening to a lecture, is a real sign that students are kind of engaged with the lesson, they're invested in it and they want to learn more. Emotional engagement is the second dimension, and this is where students experience positive reactions, such as enjoyment, interest, or a sense of belonging. So students are interested in the course, they feel safe there, and they're actually enjoying the learning, which is obviously a really great thing, and that tends to lead to other forms of engagement as well. The final dimension, but maybe one of the most important, is cognitive engagement, in which students are invested in their learning, they seek to go beyond the stated reactions, and they enjoy a challenge. So they don't just turn up and do the reading because you tell them to. They're personally invested in their learning. They want to do well for the sake of learning because they're interested in what you're teaching them. They seek to go beyond what you ask them to, and they enjoy a challenge. So when they don't just do the minimum that you tell them to, they want to challenge themselves. All these kind of things I think you'll recognise as being part of an engaged student's behaviour, but it's good to see them separated out into those 3 dimensions. So, are your students engaged? Just stop now and take a minute to write down some possible signs that students are engaged. It could be examples of behaviour that you've seen in your own students, or just what you think an engaged student might look like to a teacher. And now I'm going to shut up for 30 seconds, so you've got time to write that down. Okay, did you get a couple of signs down? Good. A couple of signs that I think make me think that a student are engaged are things like taking notes willingly, bringing a notebook to the session. It can sound like a bare minimum, but some students don't do it. Deliberately sitting at the front or sitting at the back with their friends, but still looking at you when you're talking. They might be on their laptops if they're taking notes, and some students, when they are engaged, will still be on the internet, but they might be Googling something that's related to the topic, or they might even be tweeting about how much they're enjoying what you're teaching. Engaged students tend to be smiling, they tend to make eye contact, they don't tend to arrive very late to the class if they can help it, they tend to bring everything they need, and they tend to be prepared and to have thought about things. So they haven't just kind of done the reading, they've actually thought about the reading and they've got things to say in class. Now, we're going to have a slightly more negative exercise, but along the same lines. Think about what a disengaged student would look like. Have you experienced any of those? I know I have. Just take another 30 seconds to write down some examples of behaviour that you might expect or that you've seen from disengaged students. Okay, I got lots of examples writing these down. I'm sure you did too. Sadly, sometimes there can be more examples of disengagement than engagement. A couple of mine include talking while you're talking because they're just not interested in what you're saying. You can tell if they're online and disengaged because they tend to keep typing. Even when you kind of tell everyone to stop, look at the front and think about what you're saying for a moment, these students aren't listening, so they just keep on typing messages to their friends or whatever. Disengaged students tend to look bored. Sometimes they might actually sort of close their eyes and doze off, or they might be talking about something else. So when you have, for instance, students have to turn to their partner or discuss in small groups, you can often hear some students just clearly disengaged, talking about what was on TV last night, or sometimes struggling to talk at all if they're in a small group and the rest of the group is prepared and engaged. You can spot the disengaged student because they're not joining in the conversation, because they don't feel like they've got anything to contribute. So there are lots of different tools that you can use in lesson planning to ensure student engagement. One of them is delivery, that's key. Just having a variety of activities is really important. Are the students just sitting listening to you and taking notes for an hour? Because if so, that requires a huge amount of concentration on their part, and that can often lead to very quick disengagement. Data suggests that students' performance in lectures falls off dramatically after the first 15 minutes. So they can stay awake and take notes for 15 minutes, but then that's it, they're done. But if you introduce a break every 15 minutes, their activity will go back up because you'll wake them up again, basically. So it's important to notice whether you're giving students a break, a bit of variety in there to keep it interesting. Content, also really important. Obviously you can't change the content and just say, oh, this isn't very engaging, so I'm just not going to teach you this really important theory. But if you know that content is particularly difficult, you can introduce mechanisms to check understanding, maybe a bit of light relief if the content's particularly heavy, or maybe start simple to give the students a bit of confidence before you build up to the really difficult stuff. Environment, again, really important for engagement. You might have a stuffy, hot, sleepy lecture room. You might be teaching at a low energy time of day. There are lots of different things that can affect your students, but just be aware if you find that you've got a lot of disengaged students in your class and nothing you do seems to be working, it might be environmental. And it could just be that there's nothing you can do about that. You know, we all have to teach in horrible rooms. Sometimes it's as simple as opening a window or giving students a break, or even just acknowledging, yeah, this is a really stuffy lecture room. Let me know when you need a break. You know, come 5 minutes later, but go and get yourself a coffee first. Things like that. But this is one of the ones that sometimes you just can't control. So you do as much as you can, and then if they're still not engaged because of a horrible room, that may not be your fault. There may also be individual needs that affect engagement. Students might have particular needs such as cultural issues or disability issues that affect both how they are able to actually engage and how engaged they're able to look. So sometimes students might be culturally conditioned to not speak up in class and not ask questions. So it might seem that they're not engaged, but actually they are engaging, just in a different way. But also students just have a lot going on in their lives, like everybody. So if a student is disengaged one week, it could be that it's not your fault. There's just a lot of other stuff going on in their life. And it's still their responsibility to get back on track, of course. And it's absolutely within your rights to ask them to re-engage for the lesson, but you can't always control individual levels of engagement. Teaching methods also key for engagement. And one of the most important aspects of your teaching methods is how interactive your teaching is. So even in a lecture setting where you can't necessarily have a cross-class discussion, you can maybe ask for informal feedback, so ask a question and then invite people to shout answers back at you. This will really only work for one-word answers, obviously. You can take a vote using clickers or audience response systems if you have them, or just a hands up if you don't, so put your hand up if you agree, or put your hand up if you disagree, and then you can kind of generally see which side the audience is on, and that just makes them feel like they're being involved in the lecture. You can get students to feedback after a group or pair exercise, so take 60 seconds, talk to your neighbour, and even where, again, the group is too big for them to feedback, you can just say, take 60 seconds, talk to your neighbour about something, and then turn and face me again. And you don't really need to hear them feedback, because they've been interacting with someone else. That's almost as good as interacting with you. You can also build in a fun or active element, so if you've got a small class, you can get them to draw on the whiteboard, or you can get them to find an answer online to a puzzle, or get them to maybe do some tweets or create a BuzzFeed article, silly things like that, things that I use to try and get my students a bit pepped up and getting them happy to interact with each other and interact with me. You can also check engagement with students. You can build in things in your teaching methods. So you can ask a question, see how people answer. You can stop and ask everyone how they're feeling. So you can say, are you up for a challenge, or are you completely lost? Hands up if you're one, or hands up if you're the other, and just kind of directly asking, are you engaged? Because students can be surprisingly willing to say, oh, I'm not engaged, and here's what I need for me to be engaged, and that's really useful. And even in a large class, you can get them to put their hands up if they understand, put their hands up if they don't understand, and that doesn't mean you then need to answer their questions individually, but it could just mean you need to go back a slide and explain something, or maybe bring an explanation to the next class, so even if you don't have time to explain something in more detail at that moment because it would ruin your plan, you can take that away and maybe explain it in some other way. It's also important to create an inclusive atmosphere with your teaching methods to make students engaged, and this is especially important for emotional engagement. So for shy students, or for students who culturally aren't used to speaking in front of the large group, small group work is less challenging, and it can be a great way for them to build up to speaking in front of the whole class by being able to speak to 3 or 4 people. And that's a useful way to check engagement if you think someone's being quiet, because if they're quiet but just a bit shy, they may well respond in the small group, and then you can see that they do have something to say, just they're too scared to say it to the whole class. Never ever mock students. I can't stress this enough. It doesn't matter how stupid you think a question is or how stupid you think a mistake is. Never do it. It's not worth it, because then you instantly lose the trust of the student. I find if someone makes a mistake that is humorous, so if they make a humorous misspelling, I will accept that the rest of the class is laughing, but I'll also then make a point of saying that I made a similar mistake and getting them to laugh at me, so the student doesn't feel ashamed, so there's not an atmosphere of kind of shame and mockery in your classroom. And if you think you'll need them, perhaps if you have a rowdy class or a particularly contentious topic, establish ground rules. And this can be useful to do in concert with all the students. and then you've established not what you want the class to do, but what the class want as a whole to do. So then when you need to discipline someone or tell them off, you can refer back to the rules of the whole class, so they're not just disobeying you, they're actually disobeying what their friends want to do, and they're making it harder for their friends to learn. So that's another way of creating an inclusive atmosphere while still maintaining discipline and respect. Interaction with students, really important for all the kinds of engagement. So just keep a line of open communication and be as approachable as possible. Making eye contact with students, even in a lecture, I tend to make eye contact with as many students as possible, shows that you're speaking to students, not speaking at them. And it kind of helps maintain their attention, because they know that you will know if they're asleep. Body language, really important. Just think for a minute about what you look like when you're teaching and what your body language shows to students. Do you always sit behind a desk? Do you sit in front of the students and have the students in rows? Or do you sit with them in a circle? What's that relationship like? Humour is useful, but have a light touch. Obviously, don't mock students. Be able to laugh at yourself, or maybe have a fun fact or two up your sleeve that can make you seem more approachable if you don't seem like you're taking the subject incredibly seriously. That can be really useful. Although obviously you take knowledge seriously as a teacher. Tone of voice is really important. Do you speak clearly, or do you lecture in a monotone? This is something that a surprising number of people do, and it's not their fault, because most academics aren't trained to speak. But it's just a good idea to pay attention to these kinds of things. Attitude is really important, and this will depend on your style as a teacher. So personally, I tend to be quite lax. I don't enforce harsh rules or ban people from the classroom if they're late. And your style might be completely the opposite. You might like to make rules and stick to them, which is absolutely fine. Choose the attitude that suits you, but remember, if you enforce really harsh rules, A, you'll have to live with maybe being less approachable to the students, and B, you've got to stick to them. So if you say, you can't come into my classroom if you're more than 5 minutes late, that has to mean that nobody can come into the classroom if they're more than 5 minutes late, even if they're your favourite student. And it also means that you need to stick to the same rules. So you can't be 20 minutes late. You have to show that you're subject to the same rules as them. And that is the end of the lecture. So thanks very much for your time. Now please have a look at the rest of the resources on QM+. And reflect on the questions that are asked on the QM Plus page to get ready for the Blackboard Collaborate discussion or for your seminar discussion. And thanks very much for listening.